Welcome to the Maker's Mark Masterclass. My name is Nana Sechere and I'm the Portfolio Brand Ambassador for Beam Suntory. So, we're here to talk about what may be my favorite bourbon, not gonna lie, but it's because I have a long history with it. That's most of the reason why I love it, aside from the taste and the delicious flavor and the fact that it's easy to mix. I can go on forever. But today, like always, whenever I do any sort of masterclasses, I like to talk about the brand, yes, of course, but I want to make sure that we understand the category first and foremost. So I'm going to go into a little bit of the bourbon history. I might get a little weird, might throw a little bit of an accent here and there, is what it is. But then after that, we'll talk about production, how it's made, so you understand that to the fullest, and then it'll help you understand not just Maker's Mark, but other bourbons that come in the category. Then we'll talk about the brand, talk about how this beautiful bottle and this beautiful liquid came to be. It might have something to do with these two faces behind me. And then after that, I'm gonna make a couple cocktails because once a bartender, always a bartender. And yes, I'm a brand ambassador right now, but I still have that love for making drinks as well. So without further ado, let's get started. The category of bourbon. Why do I like talking about it? Why are so many ambassadors talking about bourbon? Well, the bottom line is it's been on the rise since 2012. And in my opinion, as long as bartenders are around, it's not really gonna slow down. So back in 2012, you had the new Prohibition cocktail renaissance. So a bunch of passionate bartenders were digging up old history books, old cocktail books from guys like Jerry Thomas and Dale DeGroff, and they were starting to look at all these recipes and they said, you know what? I want to try and make these. So a lot of these cocktails, especially when we talk about American cocktails, they're made with rye whiskey. The earlier versions were made with brandy or cognac, but bourbon was a very important ingredient because Americans love bourbon. It's the spirit of America. So the cocktail renaissance happened, and a lot of these brands that have been around for ages decided that it was about time to keep on adding a bit more premium sentiment to the bottle. So rather than just making bourbon into that really harsh, strong liquid that puts hair on your chest and burns fire down your throat, they decided to actually refine their production processes and make beautiful bottles. But some of that was happening a little bit beforehand. We'll get into that, no worries. So the way that bourbon entered the market goes way back into the 1700s when you had English, Scottish, Irish, and German settlers coming to the eastern seaboard of the United States. And when I say eastern seaboard, for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm talking about places like Connecticut, Maryland, Pennsylvania, just the east side. When you're looking at the world map, whatever's closest to Europe. So they came down, and these Irish, Scottish, Germans, and English heard about this new world that Columbus discovered in 1492. But at that time period, you had the British who were trying to maintain control over the land. Back then, it wasn't called the United States, it was called the United Colonies. And they were putting in a few different regulations that weren't making the patriots too happy. So revolution was happening. So that was in the shadows. Then you also had eventually a civil war that went down. So there was a lot of turmoil and strife that was going on in America before it became what it is today. But in the background, there was always whiskey. It began with rye. And then eventually, when some of these patriots started moving inland into Kentucky, that's when bourbon started to become a thing. But why did it end up in Kentucky? Why were they moving inland? First of all, George Washington, who was the first US president, he was paying people to move inland so that they would be able to start planting crops like corn, tobacco, and hemp, and that would help fuel the economy. But not only that, they started hearing amazing stories from some of these guys that are called long hunters. And these long hunters, like Daniel Boone, used to travel across America and come back to the Eastern colonies with some amazing tales. And they would tell all these fantastic stories about crazy bears and bison and just beautiful wildlife that a lot of these people from Europe had never seen before. So slowly a migration happened, and once that migration happened, they started settling. And being the farmers they were, they started cultivating corn. They learned how to plant that corn from the Native Americans. But just as farmers do, when you plant anything, you've got to harvest it when the winter comes in, because Kentucky's got hot summers and cold winters. When they harvested, they fed their families, they fed their pigs, they sold some to the neighbors, but whatever was left over, they made whiskey. And they started experimenting with corn whiskey, which is 80% corn, but also bourbon, which has corn, rye, and malted barley. The corn's gonna give you a nice round sweetness, the rye is gonna give you spice, and the malted barley has every enzyme you need to have whiskey. So whiskey started spreading across America, down the Ohio River, down into New Orleans, one of my favorite cities, by the way. If you haven't been, go. But down to New Orleans, and people started demanding that Bourbon County whiskey. It wasn't always called Bourbon County whiskey, but it just earned that name because of where it was from. If you notice in whiskey, a lot of whiskeys are named based on the grain or where it's from. So, 2,000 distilleries sprung up in the 1800s, all family owned for the most part. But by 1919, the Prohibition happened. And when that happened, they ceased production, consumption, and distribution of all spirits in America. When you tell human beings they can't do something, chances are some of them might start doing it. So what ended up happening is speakeasy started popping up. And a speakeasy is a secret bar hidden by a secret entrance. People started drinking even more because they weren't allowed to. It was more exciting. But by 1933, the Prohibition ended, and there were about 4 families that were able to bring their distilleries back up into action. One of them, Jim Beam, the #1 selling bourbon in the entire world. And the other one is T.W. Samuels, which we'll get to in a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about the production of bourbon, just so you understand exactly what it is. Because bourbon is made very differently than a Scotch whiskey and a Japanese whiskey. But the production is very important to the industry as a whole. So, bourbon, first of all, is made with 4 different types of grains. You either have a bourbon that has corn, rye, and malted barley, or you've got a bourbon that's got corn, wheat, and malted barley. As I mentioned earlier, rye gives you spice, malted barley gives you the enzymes for whiskey, and corn gives you a nice, round sweetness. Wheat gives you sweet. Keep that in mind for a few minutes. So once you have your grains decided on, you crush those grains into a nice powder, a nice flour. And you add that flour to Kentucky limestone filtered water. Kentucky sits on a bed of limestone, and that limestone filters all the hard iron out of the water to make it soft and perfect for distillation. So once you add the flour to the soft Kentucky limestone water, you cook it down, and then you add yeast. And once you add that yeast, the yeast feeds on the sugars that are produced from the cooking, because there's little sugar enzymes that are inside all those grains. That creates a beer, a distiller's beer, which then goes through a column still and into a pot still before you age it in a barrel. Once it's aged in that barrel, beautiful things are happening. Oxidation, where oxygen is introduced and it's introducing new flavors. It's also extracting flavors from the wood because the wood has been charred. So picture a campfire where there's a piece of wood that looks like this, but on the other side, it's nice and charcoal. So that charcoal is filtering it, but also adding caramel and vanilla and beautiful flavors. Just the prototypical whiskey flavors you'd like to find. And then it just starts getting more color. it just starts becoming the whiskey that we know and love. And the longer that you age that whiskey, the better. FYI, bourbon whiskey, it's not like Scotch. They typically make it in Kentucky where it's really hot in the summer and really cold in the winter, so you can't age it as long. Scotland has the blessing of having terrible weather. And I say blessing because it gives them the ability to lengthen out that aging process. In Kentucky, after 2 years, your whiskey is done. But brands like Jim Beam, they'll age for 4 years. Maker's Mark, 6 to 7. So typically, some of the best bourbons in the world will be in that 6 to 7 year old mark. So don't judge a bourbon by its age. This brings me to the story of Maker's Mark. And it's actually one of my favorite stories when it comes down to bourbon production or any brands, because after you hear this, you'll realize that 1, it's a story of a good family, 2, it's a story of perseverance, and 3, I'm just glad the story exists because it means that I get to sip on some great bourbon every now and then. So our story begins with a whiskey named T.W. Samuel's whiskey. Remember I mentioned there were 4 distilleries that were able to reopen right after Prohibition. T.W. Samuel's was one of them. Now T.W. Samuel's was started by a man who was the high sheriff in Nelson, Kentucky, and he's actually credited with ending the Civil War and giving a pardon to some outlaws named Jesse James and Billy the Kid. That's another story. But T.W. Samuel's, his son, continued to run the distillery. The son's name was Leslie. And Leslie's the one that reopened the distillery just after Prohibition. Leslie had a son named Bill. And Bill worked for his father like any good Kentucky boy does. And he had the unfortunate distinction of not being a fan of his family's whiskey. After the Prohibition, he begged and pleaded. He said, "Hey Dad, guess what we can do? We can make a brand new whiskey. We can make it nice and smooth and easy to drink." Because you have to remember, back then, people didn't drink bourbon whiskey because they wanted a nice drinking experience. They drank bourbon whiskey because, man, my horse kicked me in the chest. I need a bottle of whiskey. Give me some of that. They weren't drinking it based on the production methods like we do today. Bourbon back then was seen as pedestrian. Leslie, Bill's father, denied his request and kept making the whiskey just as the family had always done. So, Bill went to school, he was in university, and ended up meeting a nice, beautiful woman named Margie. Margie was at the top of her class, brilliant woman, also the daughter of a master distiller, so she knew a thing or two about whiskey, and they had something in common. The two got married, they ended up having kids. Bill took over his father's distillery, and then he decided it was time to close it down. One night, he called his family into the living room, and he ends up having a bunch of candles lit. And when they sat down in the living room, Margie and the kids, Bill pulled out a piece of paper and said, "On this piece of paper is a recipe that has served our family for generations. I'm here to tell you that there's nothing on this piece of paper that will serve our family again." And he lit it on fire. And when he lit that on fire, a near unfortunate accident almost happened, but thankfully nobody got hurt. Bill sold the distillery. He sold all the businesses that were associated with the distillery. The war was happening, so Bill went to go fight in the war, came back safely, thank the Lord for that. But after he fought in the war, he wasn't really doing much. And any good woman that sees her husband sitting on the couch, sitting on the porch, not doing anything, she's gonna take one look at that guy and say one thing: "Go get a job!" So, of course, Bill went to try his hand at a few different things. They didn't work out so well. And one night, Margie pulls Bill aside and says, "You're not finding anything else out there that matches your skill set. Why don't you go back to doing what you do best and make whiskey? And Bill replied with, I don't know, Margie, I just don't want to make my father's whiskey. It's, too harsh, it's too strong, it's not the whiskey I'd like. So Margie said, well, why don't you make the whiskey you would like? And that's when the flavor vision for Maker's Mark began. Bill wanted a whiskey that wouldn't burn the back of your throat when it went down. He wanted a whiskey that would finish in the front and would be soft and easy to drink. Bill had a few friends. Few of these people worked for some distilleries that you might have heard of before. Distilleries like Jim Beam, for example. So he consulted with them. He and Margie decided that the best way to decide what grains they would use for the whiskey was to bake bread. So they baked bread and they kept testing that recipe. They do blind taste tests and finally settled on one recipe. 70% corn, 16% red winter wheat, and 14% malted barley. Bill decided that combination gave him soft and sweet bread that he just loved. So he went to work, but Margie went to work on the look. Because if you're gonna decide whether something's gonna look good or not, the best person to consult is a lady. Clearly I didn't do that today. But anyways, Margie really loved cognac. And cognac was a mark of class. They figured that they would make this new bourbon a whiskey that they could sell for a high price and make it premium. So what better way than to mimic what cognac looked like? So if you look at this bottle, it might look like some of your favorite cognac bottles, except Margie made sure it'll sit well on yourself and made that a square bottom. The first model of Maker's Mark was made out of paper mache because Margie loved art. Keep that in mind. Next, Margie went and bought a printing press. At that time, it was 10 years old. It had been made in 1933. And it printed these labels. But the labels needed a name that they couldn't quite settle on. Next, you have the red wax. Margie went into her living room, gathered every single candle in the living room, put it in the deep fryer, melted it down, and then dipped the bottle in the candle wax. These tendrils came down just like so, and from that day forward, every single bottle of Maker's Mark is hand dipped into the signature red wax. How did the name come about? Margie had a pewter collection. And you find pewter with a lot of Scottish trinkets. It's a mixed metal that you make all kinds of different cups, plates, spoons, cutlery, you name it. Flasks as well. And Margie went into her pewter collection and picked up one of the artifacts, felt it, and then she discovered a mark. She went into the living room, saw Bill sitting there and said, you know, I consider you an artist. I consider you someone that can do something that not many people in this world can. Now, as an artist, when you create something, you still need to leave your signature so everyone knows who created it. When it's all said and done, every maker must leave his mark. And that's how the name came to be. So they had the name, they had the red wax, they had the bottle shape. The whiskey was first sold in 1958. However, it wasn't very popular because, like I mentioned, people preferred their bourbons to be harsh, pedestrian. They didn't see bourbon as premium. And if it's a premium whiskey, at the time, they're spending that money on other more premium whiskeys like Scotch. It wasn't until Bill Jr. came on board, and Bill Jr. decided he was going to hit the road, do speaking engagements, create a conversation about whiskey. And when he created that conversation, he wasn't talking to other bourbon drinkers. He was talking to the Chamber of Commerce. He was talking to the press. He was speaking to all kinds of people that could influence the public. And then in 1980, everything changed. Bill put out an article with the Wall Street Journal, and it had a ton of notable recommendations from politicians, from celebrities. And after that, Maker's Mark took off. Every restaurant had to have a bottle of Maker's Mark. Everyone that drank bourbon had to have a bottle of Maker's Mark. And from there, it continued on. After that, Bill Jr. created Maker's 46. It's the same Maker's Mark batch recipe. However, they age it for an extra 9 months with French oak casks. Now, I won't get too deep into cask management, but French oak versus American oak has cinnamon and extra spices, and it makes the whiskey a bit more rich. After the Maker's 46 was created, Bill Jr.'s son, Rob, created the Private Select cask, where if you visit the distillery in Maker's Mark, you'll be able to create your own customized whiskey based on 5 available casks. It creates 1,001 possible combinations, so there's a good chance none of us will ever create the same whiskey twice. Maker's Mark today is the premium destination on the Bourbon Trail in Kentucky. If you ever go down and visit it, Maker's Mark owns its own watershed, and it's on the fast track to become the most eco-friendly distillery in the entire world. Everything is still done the exact same way they did in 1943. Everything is small batch, everything is made by hand, everything in the warehouse is rotated by hand, and as I mentioned, the signature hand dip. So, now that I've finished the story of Maker's Mark, a little bit about the category, let's get into a couple of cocktails that you can try at home. So now we're at the fun part. We get a chance to watch me make drinks. I know that's a lot of fun, but the fun part is when you get to make the drinks at home, at your bars, wherever. I'm just gonna make the Old Fashioned my style. The Old Fashioned is one of the oldest cocktails ever. Like, it's a bittered sling, and ultimately there's so many different ways of making Old Fashions, so many different variations, but I think a lot of us can agree that the Maker's Mark Old Fashioned is what we learned on, because like Bill Samuel said, he wanted something that was easy to drink, finished in the front, but also light and mixable. So, without further ado, gotta make sure your glass is chilled. All right, give it a nice little stir. Same thing with your mixing glass. Ooh, I'm gonna do this nice and slow. Make it nice and cute. So there we go, it's nice and chilled. And I'm just gonna keep my ice to the side for the time being. So now, I'm gonna add a little bit of brown sugar, because what it comes down to with the Old Fashioned and the bittered sling specifically, it's a cocktail that has sugar, bitters, and liquor. So back in the day, the cocktail meant to tame the spirit, right? So a lot of the cocktails weren't as refined as we have them now, and a lot of spirits weren't as refined. But when you add a little bit of sugar, sometimes citrus, it balanced it out and made it easier to drink. So instead of having one that you're forcing down, you're having maybe 2 or 3, and you're drinking responsibly. So after you get that sugar in, I'm gonna add some Angostura bitters. Angostura bitters, it's like the salt and pepper to a cocktail. I like to do 4 nice dashes, make it nice and pungent. I like a lot of flavor in my Old Fashions. And next, one of my favorite things about the Old Fashioned is the fact that it's got this nice orange zest. So I like to put a ton of orange zest in mine. So I'm gonna start with zesting over the glass, because what happens is you've got oils in the pith of the skin, and when you zest, the oils come out. And so the oils will go around this nice mixing glass, sponsored by Maker's Mark, And I'll drop that in there, but for good measure, I'll add 2. Bang. So now that I've added the orange zest, the bitters, and the sugar, now I'm gonna add the whiskey. And once I add that whiskey, I'm gonna put about 60 milliliters. Pour that nice and beautiful like. Love that sound. And then I'm gonna give it a little bit of a stir. Reason being, sugar, it's got a lot of granulation, right? It's pretty rough texture, but when you put it inside the liquid and you mix it with the bitters, you want it to dissolve so that when you're drinking the old fashioned, you don't get sugary, hard bits in there. It's gotta be a nice, smooth, and easy drinking experience from start to finish. So with the old fashioned, it can take a while if you're really, really being careful with it, but if you dissolve that sugar nicely, it won't take that long. Bam. All right. So now that it's nice and diluted, it's now time to add ice. Whoop. Bam. So you're stirring because you want to add what we like to call dilution. And that dilution helps all the ingredients cool down in temperature, mix properly, and then you end up with this beautiful cocktail at the end. So with the old fashioned, I like to make sure it's a nice, easy drinking experience because some whiskeys, depending on what you're using, can be very, very, very strong. Maker's Mark, thankfully, is not. So you don't have to stir it too long, but I like to make sure that when they get it, lost my train of thought. I like to make sure that when they get their old fashioned, it's amazing from start to finish. So make sure that the ice in your glass does not have any excess water. All right. So it's got some nice color on there. It's pretty clear. But now I'm going to add more orange zest. All right, so let those orange oils dust over that glass. And I'm just making sure that the edges on the zest are now nice and straight. And then the last little bit, I will squeeze the zest so that the oils come out and they're expressed. And I'll just do a nice motion over the glass, twist it. Your fingers might get a little slippery. Just hold on to your garnish. And then drop it in the glass. And there we are. Classic Maker's Mark Old Fashioned with a little bit of brown sugar. Cheers. So, now that we finished off with the Old Fashioned, we're gonna do one more classic bourbon cocktail, and that is known as the Manhattan. Again, I chose the Old Fashioned and the Manhattan because minimal ingredients, very easy to make, very easy to practice, right? I know some of you out there are incredible bartenders. I've sat at some of your bars, I've watched your YouTube videos. However, let's just pay homage to the classics. And however you like to make it, I'm sure I'm gonna enjoy it the next time I visit you. But today we're gonna make it the Maker's Mark classic way. And that is with the regular standard of Maker's Mark bourbon. And then we also have red sweet vermouth that we're gonna be using as well. And of course, Angostura bitters. But the key is making sure that you have the right balance of the bourbon to the sweet vermouth. That is the key to a good Manhattan. And of course, at the end, we're gonna garnish it with a cherry. You can serve this drink straight up. You can serve this drink on the rocks like we're gonna do today. Or just mix it and put it in your mouth. Joking, of course. But here we go. So I'm gonna put my cocktail ingredients in the mixing glass and then add ice on top. I'm gonna add 50 ml of Maker's Mark. Get a little bit of that red winter sweet. Next up, a little bit of sweet vermouth. And we're gonna do just a couple dashes of bitters. I'm gonna do 2 dashes of bitters right here. Oi. There we are. Clean as you go, folks, clean as you go. Make sure your bar stations are clean, no matter what. And now it's time to add some ice. Give it a nice stir. I just love the way the ice looks in a mixing glass. I think most of us bartenders can attest. And for those of you who aren't bartenders and you're watching, always make sure you keep your hand on the bottom of the mixing glass. Keep it steady. With the Manhattan, I like to stir for about 20 to 30 revolutions. Should be nice and cold. Perfect. And now, my friends, actually, before we do that, I'm going to make sure that there's no excess water there. Perfect. See that catch? There we are. And now, we pour. So I'm a big fan of Manhattans. This is one drink you can enjoy for an entire night, 'cause it's just a nice sipper. The sweet vermouth with the Maker's Mark just really, really goes well together, because Maker's Mark is nice, light, easy to drink, and then you have nice, sweet vermouth pairing with it. It's delicious. So now for the garnish, we are gonna do a cherry. That's the classic garnish for a Manhattan. And I like to have a little touch of cherry juice on the spoon, because it adds that extra little dimension of flavor. There we are. Drop that in there. Nice stir. And you're ready to serve.